Hello everyone, thank you for attending this session. And my name is Yoshiyuki Tabata and works at the OSS Solution Center of HITACHI. And today, I'd like to talking about overall pictures of identity provider mix-up attack patterns and trade-offs between costs and effects for its mitigations. In this session, I'd like to figure several patterns of identity mix-up attacks and list their mitigations and describe which mitigation can be effective for which patterns. I'd like to talk for about 30 minutes, and after that, I'd like to have 5 or 10 minutes for question time. This presentation slides are available in SlideShare, so please get from there. First of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Yoshiyuki Tabata, and I'm a software engineer at the OSS Solution Center of HITACHI. I mainly work as a consultant for API systems, and I've built various API systems, for example, a high security banking API system. And I'm a contributor to Swisscale, which is an OSS for API management. I've developed features around security and access control. For example, page limiting, role-based access control, OAuth-related, and so on. And I'm also a contributor to Keycloak. I developed features required for API use case based on OAuth and OIDC. For example, token revocation, refresh token setting first client, and so on. So let's get started. This is today's session's overview. This March, FAPI 1.0 Part 1 and Part 2 became OpenID final specifications. Identity provider mix-up attack is described in its security considerations. Although this attack is a very complex attack, there are few descriptions and no figures, so it is difficult for implementers to grasp the overall pictures of this attack. This speech bubble shows all sentences FAPI 1.0 describes IDP mix-up attack. In this presentation, to grasp the overall picture of the IDP mix-up attack, we list and figure several patterns of this attack, and also we list mitigations and describe which mitigation can be effective for which pattern. Several OAuth-related specifications describe the IDP mix-up attack and basically refer to the paper named OAUTHSEC, this underline. So we start with this OAuthSec paper. These are today's contents. First, I describe several patterns of IDP mix-up attacks and then describe several mitigations for each pattern. First, several patterns of IDP mix-up attacks. After describing the overview, I describe patterns divided into 2 parts. There are several assumptions here before describing IDP mix-up attack patterns. First, the OAuth client interacts with at least 2 authorization servers. If the client interacts with only 1 authorization server, the IDP mix-up attack doesn't work. Second, we assume a network attacker here. Network attacker is those who can manipulate the request in which the user sent her identity to the client, as well as the corresponding response to this request. Web attacker is, on the other hand, those who do not intercept and manipulate network messages and only control attacker IDP. OAuthSec describes these 2 patterns of attackers, but the network attacker has also the capability of the web attacker, so here we assume a network attacker. Third, we focus on authorization code flow here, not focus on implicit flow here. I briefly describe authorization code flow first. The client is registered with 2 IDP, honest IDP and attacker IDP. In honest IDP, the client's client ID is AAA. In attacker IDP, the client's client ID is BBB. This is a normal case, so the attacker is not involved here. User selects HITP in the browser. Then the client redirects the browser to HITP's authorization endpoint. That is, the client sends an authorization request. Then HITP authenticates the user via the browser. If the user is already logged on, this step is skipped. After authentication, HITP redirects the browser to the client redirect URI. That is, HITP sends an authorization response. This authorization response includes an authorization code. After that, the client sends a token request with the authorization code. And HITP sends a token response. This token response includes an access token. Then the client sends an API request with the access token. And the resource server sends an API response. This is a normal case of the authorization code flow. In this authorization code flow, vulnerable steps are the first two steps shown in the orange zone. This is because for these steps, the need for HTTPS is not obvious to users or clients, and the use of HTTPS is not suggested by the OAuth security recommendations, since the user only selects an IDP at this point. So it would be realistic to assume that a network attacker can manipulate these steps. After step 3, shown in the blue zone, in accordance with the OAuth security recommendations, the communication is encrypted by using HTTPS, so it doesn't matter to assume that it can be inspected or altered by the attacker. Actually, if the network attacker manipulates the first two steps like written in red, the attacker can get the authorization code and the access token, and finally get the user resources. This is one of the ID mix-up attack patterns, and later I describe this in detail. In this session, I described IDP mix-up attack divided into two parts. First, part A, this part is before getting the authorization code. Second, part B, this part is after getting the authorization code. So first I describe part A. There are three patterns in part A. Part A is before getting the authorization code. So this figure finishes when getting the authorization code. In this pattern A1, AIDP creates the client's new authorization request. I describe this figure step by step. User selects HITP in browser. In the normal case, the client receives this request, but in this case, the network attacker manipulates this request and makes this request reach AIDP. Then AIDP redirects the browser to the client as if the user selects AIDP. So the client delegates authorization to AIDP. This is the client send. That is the client send an authorization request to AIDP, not HITP. Then AIDP creates a new authorization request and sends it to the HITP as if the client sent authorization request to HITP. Then HITP authenticates the user via the browser. The user assumes the user selects HITP, so the user cannot detect the attack in this step. After authentication, HITP sends authorization response to the client. This authorization response includes an authorization code. HITP assumes HITP issues the authorization code to the client. After that, the client sends a token request with the authorization code to AIDP because the client assumes that the client delegates authorization to AIDP, so the attacker can get the authorization code. In this pattern A2, AIDP doesn't create a new authorization request, but transfers the client's authorization request as it is. This pattern can be done if the client ID is the same between HITP and AIDP. In this example, the client ID is AAA if both HITP and AIDP. User selects HITP in the browser. The network attacker manipulates this request and makes this request reach AIDP. Then AIDP redirects the browser to the client as if the user selects AIDP. So the client sends an authorization request to AIDP, not HITP. The steps until here are the same as pattern A1. Then AIDP just transfers the authorization request, doesn't edit anything. This can be done because the client ID is the same. After that, the steps are the same as pattern A1. HITP authenticates the user via the browser. Then HITP sends an authorization response to the client. This authorization response includes an authorization code. HITP assumes HITP issues the authorization code to the client. Then the client sends a token request with the authorization code to AIDP because the client delegates authorization to AIDP, so attacker can get the authorization code. In this pattern A3, AIDP creates AIDP's authorization request, not the client's authorization request. This pattern can be done if AIDP is registered to HITP as a client. In this example, AIDP's client ID is CCC in HITP. And the point is AIDP registers the client's React URI as a AIDP's React URI. User selects HITP in the browser. The network attacker manipulates this request and makes this request reach AIDP. Then AIDP redirects the browser to the client as if the user selects AIDP. Then AIDP redirects the browser to the client as if the user so the client sends an authorization request to the AIDP, not HITP. Then AIDP creates AIDP's authorization request, not the client's authorization request. This can be done because AIDP is registered to HITP as a client. After that, HITP authenticates the user via the browser. Then HITP sends authorization response to the client React URI. This is because AIDP registered the client's React URI as the AIDP's React URI. This authorization response includes an authorization code. HITP assumes HITP issues an authorization code to AIDP. Then the client sends a token request with the authorization code to AIDP because the client assumes that the client delegates authorization to AIDP, so that the attacker can get the authorization code. There are 3 patterns in part A. So next I describe part B. There are 2 patterns in part B. Part B is after getting the authorization code. So this figure starts with getting the authorization code. In this pattern B1, the attacker redeems the authorization code for access token. After getting an authorization code, the attacker sends a token request to HITP. Then HITP sends a token response to AIDP, so the attacker can get an access token. After that, the attacker sends an API request to the resource server using the access token and get the user resource. This is pattern B1. In pattern B2, the attacker sends the authorization code to the client to imitate a real login. After getting an authorization code, the attacker starts a new authorization flow using attacker's own browser. The attacker selects HITP as IDP, and the client sends an authorization request to HITP. After authentication, HITACHI sends an authorization response to the client. At this timing, the attacker intercepts the authorization response at the attacker's browser, and the attacker replaces the authorization code in the authorization response to one stealing before. Then the attacker sends the modified authorization response to the client. The client sends a token request to HITACHI. Then token request includes the victim's authorization code. Then HITACHI sends an authorization response to the client. The client trusts the authorization response, so the attacker can log in to the client as the victim user. This is pattern B2. Here, I organized the whole IDP mix-up attack patterns. Part A contains 3 patterns, and Part B contains 2 patterns. Then the whole patterns are 6 patterns, the combination of both parts patterns. From the next, for each pattern, we consider which mitigation is effective. Next, IDP mix-up attack mitigations for each pattern. In this session, I describe 7 mitigations. Mitigation 1 is using a distinct React URI for each IDP. This mitigation is a well-known defense, for example, written in OAuth security BCP. The client saves IDP information to which sent an authorization request and checks the matching between the distinct React URI for the IDP and the URI that authorization response was received. Here, regarding pattern 1 to 4, I describe how this mitigation 1 works. User select HITACHI in their browser. The network attacker manipulates this request and makes this request reach AIDP. Then AIDP redirects the browser to the client as if the user selects AIDP. So the client sends an authorization request to AIDP, not HITACHI. Before sending the authorization request, the client saves that the user selects AIDP to something like a session. Then AIDP sends an authorization request to HITACHI. Just transferring patterns 3 and 4 is also okay. After that, HITACHI authenticates the user via the browser. Then HITACHI sends an authorization response to the client React URI. This React URI is only for HITACHI, so the client can detect the authorization response came from HITACHI, not AIDP. So the client can avoid this interaction and doesn't send a token request to AIDP. So this mitigation 1 is effective for patterns 1 to 4. In pattern 5, on the other hand, the attacker can set AIDP's React URI freely. So the attacker can set AIDP's React URI to HITACHI. So this check is broken. HITACHI sends an authorization response to the client at this time. And the React URI is for AIDP's React URI because AIDP said so. So the client cannot detect the authorization response came from HITACHI. In pattern 6, this is not so related to this mitigation. IDP usually ensures that the authorization code sent from the client was actually issued to the client, so HITACHI can detect this mismatch. For example, this check is written mandatory in RFC 6749. I mean, HITACHI received an authorization code from the client at this timing, but this authorization code is which HITACHI actually issued to AIDP, so HITACHI can detect this mismatch. So HITACHI doesn't send a token response to the client, and the attacker cannot log in as the victim user. Mitigation 2 is using the request object in the authorization request. The request object is a JOT including whole request parameters, usually used to prevent tampering with request parameters. In this mitigation, the request object must be signed and HIDP must deny an authorization request not containing the request object. Here, regarding patterns 1 and 2, I describe how this mitigation 2 works. In patterns 1 and 2, AIDP creates the client's new authorization request at this time. However, AIDP cannot create a request object because the request object is signed with the client's secret key. Unless AIDP steals the client's secret key, AIDP cannot create the client's valid request object. So HIDP can detect the authorization request from AIDP is wrong when signature check. If the request object contains ISS claim and AUD claim, this is of course recommended by standards. This mitigation 2 is effective for patterns 3 and 4. In patterns 3 and 4, AIDP just transfer the client's authorization request as it is. So if HIDP performs only signature checks, HIDP cannot detect the attack because the request object is signed by the client. However, if HIDP also performs AUD claim check, HIDP can detect the attack. This is because AUD claim include AIDP because the request object is originally for AIDP, and HIDP only accepts the request object which AUD claim includes HIDP, so the attack can be detected. However, if the attacker creates his own request object like a pattern 5, HIDP cannot detect the attack. This is because the attacker can set HIDP to AUD claim at this timing and sign with AIDP's secret key. HIDP judges the request object is AIDP's honest request object. So HIDP cannot detect the attack. In pattern 6, as the same as mitigation 1, this is not so related to this mitigation. HIDP can detect the mismatch of the authorization code's client and the requesting client. Mitigation 3 is using a strong client authentication method. If using a strong client authentication method, the client can prevent redeeming the authorization code for an access token, even if the authorization code was provided to the attacker. Strong client authentication methods are private key JOT, TLS client auth, self-signed TLS client auth. The client authentication method using a client secret, such as client secret post, client secret basic, and client secret JOT, are acceptable if the client is capable of maintaining the confidentiality of the client secret and doesn't use the same client secret in multiple IDPs. The public client doesn't use any client authentication, so out of the question. HIDP must accept strong client authentication methods only. Here, regarding patterns 1 and 3, I describe how this mitigation 3 works. If the client reuses the client secret in multiple IDPs, AIDP can easily get the client secret at this time. So AIDP can send an honest token request to HIDP. However, if the client uses strong client authentication methods or doesn't use the client secret, AIDP cannot get the client secret. So the client authentication at HIDP fails. Then the attacker cannot get an access token. However, if the attacker requests token as a client, like a pattern 5, HIDP cannot detect the attack. This is because the attacker can use AIDP's client credential at this timing. So the client authentication succeeds. When imitating login by replacing the authorization code like patterns 2 and 4, HIDP cannot detect the attack. This is because client uses the client's client credential at this timing. So the client authentication succeeds. So the attacker can log in to the client as the victim user. In pattern 6, as the same as mitigations 1 and 2, this is not related to this mitigation. HITACHI can detect the mismatch of the authorization codes client and the request client. Mitigation 4 is client-based access control. By using the mapping information of clients and resources, the resource server checks the requested resource is allowed to the requesting client or not. The requesting client can be usually identified with AZP claim bound to access token, but if so, the attack is not detected in patterns 1 and 3. This is because in these patterns, AZP claim contains the client that is the correct value. If the requesting client is identified with CNF claim defined by RFC 8705, which contains the hash value of the client certificate, the attack can be detected in patterns 1 and 3. This is because in these patterns, the IDP cannot send the client's client certificate to the resource server. The resource server can detect the API request is not coming from honest party and doesn't send an API response. In pattern 5, the resource server can detect the attack by client-based access control. In this pattern, it doesn't matter that the client can be identified with whether AZP claim or CNF claim because both claims contain AIDP's information. The resource server can judge the API request is coming from AIDP, so doesn't send an API response. In patterns 2 and 4, the attack is working where the resource server is not existing, so this mitigation has no effect. In pattern 6, as the same as other mitigations, this is not so related to this mitigation. HITACHI can detect mismatch of the authorization codes client and the requesting client. Mitigation 5 is using new authorization response parameters called ISS parameter, which represents IDP, and client ID parameter, which represents the client. These parameters are defined by OAuth 2.0 mix-up mitigation. It is yet in that draft. By using these parameters, the client can detect a mismatch of the combination of IDP and client. Of course, the client must implement the validation logic of ISS parameter and client ID parameter. Here, regarding patterns 1 to 4, I describe how this mitigation 4 works. As the same as mitigation 1, the client saves that the user selects AIDP to something like a session this timing. And the client checks ISS parameter and client ID parameter at this timing. Here, ISS parameter represents HIDP, not AIDP. So the client can detect the attack. Regarding patterns 5 and 6, the client can detect the attack as the same as patterns 1 to 4. This time, the client checks client ID parameter at this timing. And here, client ID parameter represents AIDP, not the client. So the client can detect the attack. Mitigation 6 is using an ID token as a detached signature. This is defined by OAUTHSEC Core 1.0 and OAuth 2.0 multiple response type encoding practices. When the client sends an authorization request, specify ID token to the response type parameter. Then HIDP sends an ID token in the authorization response. ID token includes ISS claim and AUD claim. So using these claims, detect the attack as the same as mitigation 5. Regarding patterns 1 to 4, ISS claim represents HIDP, not AIDP, so the client can detect the attack. Regarding patterns 5 and 6, the client can detect the attack as the same as pattern 1 to 4. This time, the client checks the AUD claim at this timing. And here, AUD claim represents AIDP, not the client. So the client can detect the attack. Mitigation 7, this is the last, is following JARM, JOT Secured Authorization Response Mode for OAuth 2.0. When the client sends an authorization request, specify query.jot to the response mode parameter. Then HITACHI sends the JOT in the authorization response. The JOT includes ISS claim and AUD claim, so using these claims, detect the attack as the same as mitigations 5 and 6. Regarding patterns 1 to 4, ISS claim represents HITACHI, not AIDP, so the client can detect the attack. Regarding patterns 5 and 6, the client can detect the attack as the same as patterns 1 to 4. This time, the client checks AUD claim at this timing, and here, AUD claim represents AIDP, not the client, so the client can detect the attack. Finally, I list 4 mitigations and their effectiveness on each pattern. Mitigations 5, 6, and 7 prevent the IDP mix-up attack completely, and FAPI 1.0 recommends satisfying mitigation 6 or mitigation 7. By following this list, we can consider how to deal with each pattern. For example, we can combine mitigation 1 and mitigation 4, or add original mitigation to where the existing system cannot detect. This is today's session summary. We described 6 patterns of IDP mix-up attack, 7 mitigations of the attack, and which mitigation can be effective for which pattern. The best mitigation is that client interacts with only one authorization server, but it may be difficult to accept it considering usability. The effectiveness of mitigations described here was only focusing IDP mix-up attacks, so when adapting to the real environment, it is necessary to consider other factors combined with, such as effectiveness of 2 other attacks. This presentation slides are available in SlideShare, so please get from there. Thank you for listening. Now, I'd like to have 5 or 10 minutes for questions, and I welcome your comments as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that presentation. I think this is very interesting work and also very much needed because probably all of these variants have been discussed at some point, but it's good to have an overview, especially what we see on the slide, to see what helps against what. I have a couple of questions. The first one would be whether I understood A3 correctly, that the attacker uses a new client ID at the IDP. That would also mean that the user sees at the honest IDP that a different client is used, right? And
it's not great.
So if the user would see the client ID at the honest IDP, the user would see CCC. Right?
Yes. If the login screen or consent screen is displayed to the client, if the user carefully checks the login screen or consent screen, the client ID CCC is displayed to the screen. But maybe this is there is a possibility to skip it if already logged on. So that is a real difficult for users to prevent this, I think.
Yeah, so this hints at a more general OAuth problem that you can try to impersonate other clients. So of course, the user wouldn't see the client ID, but would see, for example, a name or a logo registered with that client. And that means that the attacker would have to create a client with the same logo or name, for example. So this is a problem that can occur in OAuth setups. And the attacker would essentially have to do the same here as well. So if the honest IDP always carefully checks that nobody impersonates somebody else, no client impersonates some other client, then this attack would be excluded. But we know that's not happening most of the time. Okay. Then for the so for the you said you assume the network attacker because the user, I think, when I saw that correctly, in A1, 2, and 3, the user always selects the honest IDP. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I also considering the this is the yeah, this is described in the variant attacks in OAuthSec. The user select AIDP pattern in OAuthSec,
Yeah.
but in my understanding, not so different if the user select HIDP or AIDP, because maybe this authentication screen show this is AIDP or HIDP, and other things maybe not so different between user select AIDP or HIDP, I think.
Yeah, I would second that. So I also don't think it's it has a big impact on the attacks or mitigations. But I think this is the stronger variant of the mix-up attack because you don't need the network attacker.
Oh, yeah.
Because this network attacker model also assumes that you use HTTP in the beginning. And that is increasingly unlikely. So it's very unlikely already today. So I think that this is the stronger model, and it would be interesting to see if your findings translate into this model as well, like all the mitigations and the results would be the same. I think they would be, but that would be interesting to check, especially with the signed request objects. And the last question would be, you said that in mitigation 5, the issuer, when the issuer is used or when it's returned from the authorization response, does the client actually have to check the client ID? I don't think so. I know that it was in the earliest drafts for the issuer parameter, but I don't think that it's strictly needed.
Maybe in this pattern, I think the client need to check the client ID because if a moment, please.
I mean, in the pattern you have on the screen here, the client would have stored a IDP, who would then see in the issuer H IDP. So in this example, the issuer would be enough.
Oh yeah, I think so too. Maybe not. correct, I think. Yeah, I think so. If we can check ISS parameter correctly, maybe client ID parameter check is not mandatory here, I think.
Yeah. Good.
So,
I mean, if you have another example, would be very interesting because we're currently standardizing the ISS parameter. And we would need to change the spec then, but I don't think it should be needed.
maybe I don't remember correctly, but maybe this save AIDP is a key point if ISS parameter is not needed. If I don't remember correctly, it is described in the post-1.0 mix-up mitigation. But if the client not save AIDP, then maybe the client parameter is need to be checked.
That could help if the client doesn't store the issuer in some situations. But so in the draft for the issuer parameter, we assume that the client does store the IP, so it should be safe.
Okay, so yeah, you're right. Maybe if the client save AIDP to something like the session, client only check the ISS parameter is enough, I think.